In 1874, 3 armed men entered the coal-scarred mountains, and only one came out alive, a 12-year-old boy. It was September, deep in the wilds of West Virginia, when 3 heavily armed enforcers for the most powerful company in the state, the Consolidated Coal Company, vanished near Elkhorn Creek. Days later, their bodies turned up in shallow graves, each shot dead by a weapon no child should even be able to lift. And yet, the only witness, and the only survivor, was Thomas Weaver, a boy barely tall enough to see over the barrel of the rifle he carried. His clothes were torn, blood-stained, and when questioned, he looked the sheriff dead in the eye and said 3 chilling words. They deserved worse. Authorities buried the case, and the bodies, fast. Officially, the files were resolved by mutual agreement. Unofficially, the miners who found the corpses never forgot the boy's cold stare. But here's the part no one was supposed to know. Those men weren't random victims. They were the coal company's enforcers, and Thomas had just declared war. This wasn't just revenge, it was the start of something the mountains would never forget. Over the next few months, fear spread like wildfire. Trains derailed. Supply depots burned. Armed patrols vanished without a sound. And every time, a single boot print, too small for a grown man, was found nearby. Some say Thomas Weaver was just a boy. Others say, he was the curse the coal company created. And in those Appalachian hills, his name still means one thing: don't go into the woods alone. Imagine an industry so powerful it could eat entire towns alive, coal and the men who mined it. This was West Virginia in the late 1800s, small mountain communities that had thrived for generations suddenly crushed under the roar of mining machines and endless coal. Trains. The air that once smelled of pine and wildflowers now burned your throat with coal dust and sulfur. And the people in charge? They didn't just own the land, they owned you. The Consolidated Coal Company bought up vast stretches of forest, building company towns like poisonous mushrooms in the wilderness. Houses sank into the earth as the mines below swallowed the ground. The law didn't matter here, because the company had its own army. They called them the Coal Police. No badges. No uniforms. Just men with guns, deciding who could eat, who could keep their home, and who would be dragged into the woods, never to return. These weren't heroes, they were ex-Confederate soldiers, battle-scarred Union vets, drifters, and criminals. Violence was their native language. They lived in a rotten boarding house locals called Devil's Rest, where they drank cheap whiskey and plotted new ways to terrify anyone who dared speak up. If you spoke against the company, you didn't just lose your job, you lost everything. Families like the Weavers, 3 generations deep in these mountains, were trapped in a cruel game. The company didn't pay in money, but in script, fake currency only usable at company stores, where prices were jacked up so high you could never pay off your debt. This wasn't a job, it was a cage. And the coal police held the keys. Imagine living in a house so bad it could freeze you in winter, and cook you alive in summer, and you still had to pay rent. That was life in West Virginia's coal country. Wages were already tiny, and the company snatched part of them back for shacks that leaked in the rain and baked in the heat. But Thomas Weaver's family? They were different. They still had an independent cabin, one of the last not owned by the company. Overlooking Elkhorn Creek, it was built from hand-hewn logs by Thomas's grandfather, Ezekiel, a War of 1812 veteran. Inside, the walls were covered in deer hides and bear skins from a time when wildlife roamed freely, before the mines drove it all away. Thomas's father, Samuel, was the kind of man forged in war and coal dust. At just 38, his hands were twisted from years of swinging a pickaxe, his back bent from crawling through tunnels no taller than a child, his lungs scarred from breathing black dust. He had fought for the Union in the Civil War, learning both the value of discipline and the brutal cost of violence. When he returned home in 1865, he dreamed of farming in peace. But the coal company killed that dream. Every workday began before the sun even touched the mountains. In the freezing pre-dawn, Samuel would wake his sons, Thomas and 17-year-old Jacob, speaking in whispers so as not to disturb sleeping neighbors. Breakfast was cornmeal mush with molasses, maybe eggs from their 3 surviving chickens. The rest had died, choked by the coal dust that coated everything. Jacob was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong, just like his father, but his eyes burned with defiance. And in coal country, defiance could get you killed. 6 months earlier, he'd started the dangerous job of timber setter, installing the beams that kept tunnels from collapsing. It demanded strength, precision, and absolute focus. One mistake, and the mountain itself could bury you alive. One wrong move underground, and the mountain could crush you alive. That's what Jacob Weaver faced every day. A single poorly placed beam could trigger a cave-in, burying entire crews without warning. He'd already watched 3 men die in accidents the company could have prevented, if they'd just bought proper safety gear. But when Jacob complained about rotting timbers that should have been replaced weeks ago, his boss, Garrett Mills, a rat-faced man with a smile like a knife, told him that questioning company rules was grounds for instant firing. Then, with a smirk, he hinted that accidents happened to troublemakers. Thomas Weaver was nothing like his father or brother, and that scared even his own family. Small for his 12 years, he had a dangerous kind of intelligence, the ability to read people like a book, predicting their next move with eerie precision. While other kids played games, Thomas calculated. His mother had died giving birth to him in the deadly winter of 1862, no doctors, his father off at war. So Thomas was raised by his grandfather Ezekiel, a War of 1812 veteran who believed weakness was an invitation to be destroyed. Under Ezekiel's ruthless training, Thomas became a predator. He could hunt, track, move silently, and shoot with deadly accuracy. His weapon? A .44 caliber Spencer repeating rifle, 7 rounds, lever action, lightning fast. Against single-shot rifles, that was like bringing a machine gun to a knife fight. Ezekiel had taken it from a dying Union soldier during the retreat from Richmond and kept it in perfect condition ever since. But the real weapon was Thomas himself. He'd been taught to read every footprint, find water and shelter anywhere, and, when it was time, think like the most dangerous thing in the woods. By the fall of 1874, this place was ready to explode. For months, tensions between the miners and the Consolidated Coal Company had been boiling. Wages? Cut twice that summer. Prices at the company store? Jacked sky-high for flour, bacon, and kerosene, locking families into a debt trap they could never escape. Kids went to bed hungry while company bosses lived in massive mansions built from the sweat, and sometimes the blood, of mountain families. And inside the mines? It was a death trap. Cave-ins happened almost weekly. If you refused dangerous work, you were blacklisted and run out of town. The company's motto might as well have been, "Men are replaceable. Coal is not." The coal police? They'd stopped pretending to follow the law. Now, they stormed into independent settlements like the Weavers, searching homes without warrants, stealing livestock, and showing up in the dead of night to make unspoken threats that needed no explanation. And then, September 15th happened. That morning, Samuel Weaver made the decision that would define the rest of his life, and end it. Before descending into the choking darkness of mine number 7 for what he didn't know would be his final shift, Samuel tucked a folded sheet of paper into his jacket. It was a petition, months in the making, written in his careful hand, on paper the family could barely afford. It listed every ignored safety violation, rotting timbers that cracked under unstable rock, ventilation so bad men collapsed from poisonous gas, equipment so faulty accidents weren't possible, they were inevitable. And Samuel was about to put it right into the company's face. 47 men had just signed their own death warrants. On a single sheet of paper, they accused the company of forcing miners into tunnels so dangerous that death was almost certain. They named names, supervisors who threatened to fire and blacklist anyone who refused, leaving them to choose between their lives and their family's survival. These weren't outsiders or agitators. They were fathers, sons, mountain men who'd buried friends in preventable cave-ins, watched their children grow pale and thin from hunger, and seen their parents die from illnesses that company doctors refused to treat because it cost too much. Samuel believed there was still a chance for reason. His plan was careful: present the petition to Foreman Augustus Blackwood during shift change, when witnesses would be present and violence less likely. It was risky, but it gave them hope. hoped that words might still matter. But one of those 47 signatures belonged to a man who could not afford loyalty. Henry Caldwell was drowning in debt at the company store. His youngest daughter was dying of consumption, and her only access to treatment was through the company doctor. Management offered him a choice: betray the others, or watch his daughter's care disappear. Faced with a father's nightmare, Henry made the choice that would doom them all. By the time Samuel's boots hit the ladder leading down into the black throat of the mine, Blackwood already knew. The coal police were waiting, summoned hours before. Augustus Blackwood wasn't a foreman in the traditional sense. He was a blunt instrument in human form, promoted for his political connections and his taste for violence against dissenters. To him, this petition wasn't a grievance. It was an act of war. Samuel descended deeper, unaware that each rung carried him closer to an ambush. He thought he was delivering a message. In reality, he was stepping into a trap that would decide whether any of those 47 men would ever see daylight again. They thought this was just a petition, but in the minds of Black Hollow, a piece of paper could get you killed. To Augustus Blackwood, the petition wasn't just a list of demands, it was an act of war, a direct strike at the system of fear that kept the mines profitable and the workers silent. The confrontation exploded without warning. Samuel stepped forward, the folded paper trembling slightly in his calloused hands. His voice was calm, deliberate, as he explained the men weren't looking for trouble, they just wanted a chance to work without walking into their graves every morning. Blackwood didn't speak. He stared, unblinking, his pale eyes pinning Samuel in place like a hawk staring down a rabbit. Then, with a sudden motion, he ripped the petition to shreds and let the pieces fall like dead leaves to the coal-dusted floor. "I want every man who signed this paper in my office after the shift," he said. His voice was flat, cold, and everyone knew what it meant. These weren't meetings. These were death sentences. Samuel understood instantly. Not showing up would bring worse consequences, not just for him, but for his family. That night, over cornbread, beans, and the rabbit Thomas had caught that morning, Samuel told his sons the truth. His words were careful, each one a piece of armor for them to carry when he was gone. He spoke of duty, honor, and the razor-thin line between courage and foolishness. Jacob's reaction was predictable. Fight. Gather weapons. Meet the company's thugs head-on. That was how young men thought wars were won. Thomas stayed silent, his eyes shifting between father and brother, reading the fear that neither of them said out loud. Then came the sound, hoofbeats. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of approach that said the riders weren't in a hurry, because their prey had nowhere to run. Samuel rose, his hand brushing the hilt of the hunting knife at his belt. He stepped to the window, its glass warped and clouded with coal dust. Outside, 3 men dismounted with the casual confidence of predators already certain of their kill. Samuel recognized them instantly. Marcus Finch. Dale Hutchinson. James Crawford. The triumvirate of violence, the coal company's enforcers, feared across the entire region. Their arrival at his cabin meant only one thing: whatever was about to happen had been planned at the very top. Marcus Finch led them. A former Confederate cavalry officer, his unit infamous for the brutal way they treated Union prisoners. Tall, lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes like chips of frozen winter, Finch radiated controlled cruelty. He wore a black suit, always spotless, no matter how dirty the job, and carried a pair of Colt revolvers, the grips worn smooth from constant use. Dale Hutchinson was Finch's opposite. A mountain of muscle, his scarred hands told the story of a man who solved problems with raw force. He claimed to have served in Sherman's army, no one knew if it was true, and no one dared ask. Hutchinson didn't just do violence, he enjoyed it. When fear wasn't enough, he made examples. James Crawford was the most dangerous of them all precisely because he didn't look dangerous. Average height, thinning brown hair, a face you'd forget in a crowd. He could have been a shopkeeper, but he was a killer without empathy. No anger. No passion. Just cold, precise efficiency. When a job required planning instead of brawn, Crawford was the one they sent. The air in the cabin felt heavy as Finch spoke first, his tone calm, almost polite. but sharpened by the authority of a man accustomed to being feared. "Your petition has been noted," he said. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. And you have 30 days to vacate this cabin." The claim that the company had purchased the land as part of an expansion into the upper reaches of Elkhorn Creek was a lie, but it didn't matter. It was the kind of lie that became truth when backed by guns and bought judges. The coal company had perfected the theft of land, fraudulent deeds, intimidated witnesses, and courtrooms where the outcome was bought long before the gavel dropped. Families who'd held their property for generations would wake one morning to find their ownership erased by a clerical error, a miscalculated tax bill, or a conveniently incorrect survey line. Jacob, young, quick-tempered, too much like his father at that age, made the mistake of thinking this was still a conversation. He asked what compensation they'd receive for the years of work and improvements they'd made to the land. It was a fair question. But it was the wrong question. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a show of force, a warning to everyone within earshot. Hutchinson moved like a hammer. One massive arm swung, a backhand that caught Jacob full in the face. The blow slammed him into the cabin wall, blood splattering across the wood. 17 years old, crumpled, bleeding, but still conscious. That was the point. Hurt him, humiliate him, but leave him breathing so he could spread the fear. Samuel took a step forward to help his son, and that's when Crawford moved. Silent until now, he drew a nickel-plated Remington with the ease of a man reaching for a teacup. The barrel pressed cold against Samuel's temple. A .44 round inside, ready to scatter his brains across the wall. "You seem to have forgotten who runs these mountains, Weaver," Crawford said, voice low but razor-sharp in the heavy silence. "Maybe it's time you and your boy learned some respect for your betters." What happened next would etch itself into Thomas Weaver's memory like a brand, burning away any illusion he had about law or justice. His father stood frozen, a gun to his head. His brother lay bleeding at his feet. And the coal police, 3 predators in human skin, were only getting started. They were deciding how to kill the Weavers like they were talking about cutting timber. Finch wanted them gone, no bodies, no evidence, just a ghost story to scare the rest of the miners into obedience. Hutchinson wanted it public, a hanging, raw and brutal, their corpses swaying in the wind as a lesson no one could ignore. Crawford, ever the pragmatist, preferred silence, deep graves in the mountains where no man would ever stumble upon the bones. Thomas sat in the corner, listening. Silent. Still. Forgotten. But not powerless. He watched as the coal police shoved his father and brother out the door at gunpoint. Through the cabin's cloudy glass, he saw them marching toward the tree line. Finch's rope dangled in the fading light. Crawford carried a shovel. Hutchinson's sack sagged with lime, ready to erase all trace of the dead. Thomas's stomach turned to ice. He knew they weren't coming back. But the coal police didn't know Thomas. They didn't know he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. When the sound of their voices faded into the black woods of Elkhorn Creek, Thomas moved. Not in panic, in precision. From beneath a loose floorboard by the fireplace, he pulled the Spencer rifle. Its walnut stock was worn smooth by years of handling. The leather cartridge pouch rattled with 47 rounds of .44 caliber ammunition, each bullet polished, inspected, perfect. Every single one could mean the difference between life and death. This rifle wasn't just a weapon, it was part of him. He'd fired it thousands of times, hitting tin cans at 50 yards, playing cards at double that. 7 shots in under 30 seconds, deadly accurate. But tonight, the game wasn't deer. It wasn't rabbits. Tonight, Thomas Weaver was hunting men. They thought a 12-year-old couldn't kill them. Men who had butchered for money and for sport, men who had carved fear into the bones of an entire county, were about to learn how wrong they were. The night, which they believed cloaked their work, was in fact Thomas Weaver's ally. He had roamed these forests since before he could hold a rifle, learning how wind bent sound, how every deer path curved, where every fallen log lay like a hidden wall, and which stony ledges turned a boy into a ghost with a perfect line of fire. And Thomas knew something his father and brother never had, the first rule of violence: the fight is over before the other man even knows it's begun. The Cole police thought they were walking two unarmed prisoners to their deaths. They didn't know death was already stalking them from the trees. Thomas ghosted through the darkness, not behind them, but alongside, matching their pace. From their low voices, he caught their destination, Hangman's Hollow. A place with a name soaked in blood. Confederate irregulars had strung up captured Union soldiers there, the roots beneath the soil tangled with rope and bone. Even now, floods sometimes spit up fragments of the dead. It was exactly the kind of place men like Finch, Hutchinson, and Crawford would choose, isolated, steeped in old terror, and close enough to running water to wash the blood away. By the time they fought through the undergrowth, Thomas was already there. He lay prone on a rocky ledge above the clearing, hidden by mountain laurel, every sight line mapped in his mind. He could fire in any direction. He could vanish before they ever pinpointed him. And now, he waited. The first man died before he even knew the boy was there. Thomas lay motionless behind his mountain laurel blind, the Spencer rifle braced in a hollow of rock that steadied his aim like a sniper's rest. The night carried their voices to him in broken threads, Hutchinson's growl about the long walk, Crawford's clinical talk about grave depth in Rocky Mountain soil, Finch's coarse laughter at Samuel's petition, mocking what the miners would say after his vanishing. When the four shapes finally bled into the clearing, the faint starlight framed the scene in silver and shadow. Samuel and Jacob stumbled forward, bound hand and foot, prodded like livestock toward slaughter. The Cole police moved with the lazy confidence of predators who believed the kill was inevitable. Finch, all authority and arrogance, ordered Hutchinson to drive the prisoners to their knees beside a toppled oak, a natural wall to trap their bodies when the earth was heaped over them. Crawford, wordless, started digging, each thrust of the shovel precise and practiced, as if digging graves was just another day's work. The rifle's crack shattered the night. A single .44 caliber slug punched into Finch's chest, lifting him from his feet and hurling him backward into the creek. He landed face down, the water swallowing him, swirling dark with his blood. Hutchinson and Crawford froze, then panicked. They dove for cover, shouting curses into the darkness, searching for an enemy they could not see. But Thomas was already gone. He slid from his perch to a fresh position, every movement silent, every step calculated. The Spencer's lever clacked as he ejected the smoking brass, chambered a fresh round, raised the rifle again. His hands didn't shake. They didn't even think. They only hunted. 3 bullets. 3 men. Less than 10 seconds. Thomas breathed slow, letting the night fill his lungs, and squeezed the trigger. The Spencer barked, one smooth motion, no hesitation. By the time Hutchinson understood where the fire was coming from, Thomas was already gone, melting into the shadows. The second shot tore through the darkness and through Dale Hutchinson's skull before he could finish using Jacob as a shield. His huge body crumpled forward, pinning the boy but leaving him alive. Now only Crawford remained, and fear hollowed him out. Instead of seeking cover, he bolted for the tree line, abandoning his prisoners in a blind dash toward his horse. Exactly what Thomas had counted on. The third shot was the hardest. Thomas tracked the fleeing figure through shifting branches, judging his speed, adjusting for every step. His grandfather had trained him for harder targets, running deer in dense timber. A man was slower, bigger, and far more predictable. Crawford was 20 yards from the trees when the .44 slammed into his back. He pitched forward into the mud, sliding down the bank until the creek took him, half submerged in the same current that carried away Marcus Finch's blood. Silence followed. Only water moved. Samuel and Jacob stared at 3 bodies, trying to understand how the smallest member of their family had just saved them. Thomas stepped from the forest without a sound. The Spencer rested lightly in his hands, his face calm, almost bored, as if he had been hunting rabbits. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling to cut his father's bonds with a knife that seemed to appear from nowhere. His voice was steady, casual, utterly untouched by the killing he'd just done. Samuel, blood still rushing back into his numb hands, could only stare at the boy who was his son. Samuel and Jacob would have to vanish, completely and forever. No visits, no letters, no word sent through old friends. They would live as ghosts in their own homeland, their names spoken only in whispers, their faces fading from memory until even rumor gave way to silence. The bodies of Finch, Hutchinson, and Crawford would be covered where they lay, lime scattered thick to hasten decay. The forest would swallow them, and the creek would wash away the last of their blood. Evidence of Samuel's and Jacob's murders would be left just far enough from the clearing to suggest an ambush on the way home: spent cartridges, torn cloth, a blood trail artfully arranged. Thomas explained it all with the calm precision of a man who had studied not only the land, but the minds of the men who ruled it. He knew how the company thought, how its investigators would weigh inconvenience against truth. They wouldn't dig too deep, not if the story suited their purposes. "You'll be dead by morning," Thomas said flatly, "and that's the only way you'll stay alive." Samuel felt the weight of those words settle on his chest like a stone. It was a plan born from necessity, but it was also a kind of exile, a life sentence handed down by a boy whose hands had not yet known the softness of adulthood. As they worked in the cold darkness, the sound of shovels and the slow, sucking pull of wet earth seemed to mark time in a different way, measured not in minutes, but in the number of steps left before the weavers ceased to exist. When the last grave was covered and the false trail laid, Thomas stood for a moment, listening to the night. No guilt. No hesitation. Only the certainty that this was the way it had to be. They weren't just leaving their home behind, they were erasing themselves from existence. Every trace of who they were, every possession, every memory tied to their names had to be abandoned. Samuel and Jacob would travel hundreds of miles, vanishing into new identities provided by distant relatives who had promised shelter without questions. There would be no return to West Virginia, no letters, no whispered phone calls. They would never know how their sacrifice shaped the boy they left behind. Thomas, meanwhile, would remain, alone in a world that had already tried to destroy him, armed with nothing but his intelligence, his rifle, and a grim understanding that survival sometimes meant becoming more dangerous than the threat itself. He would carry secrets heavy enough to crush a grown man, the kind that would wall him off from every relationship he might ever try to build. The burial of the three Cole police stretched deep into the night. Samuel and Jacob worked by moonlight, shovels biting into earth, digging just deep enough to hide the bodies from discovery but not so deep that the dawn would catch them. Thomas stood watch, his senses razor-sharp, ears straining for the faintest echo of approaching riders. His advice on soil density, drainage, and concealment was chillingly precise, as though this wasn't the first time he had thought about hiding bodies. The chosen site lay beneath the sprawling roots of an ancient oak, its gnarled limbs shielding the disturbed ground from view. The roots would one day wind themselves through bone, making any exhumation nearly impossible. Thomas scattered leaf mold and forest debris over the graves, then carved faint blazes into nearby trunks, invisible to the untrained eye, yet enough to guide him back if needed. By the time the first light bled into the horizon, the three weavers had gathered the meager belongings Samuel and Jacob would take on their journey. The deception was ready, a plan that would protect the two men and leave Thomas shaped into something no 12-year-old should ever become. Before they parted, Samuel pulled his son aside. His voice trembled, though he fought to keep it steady. "Remember that we love you. Remember this is not just to save ourselves, but to keep other families from enduring what we did. And one day, when you are strong enough, you will make sure it never happens again." Thomas didn't cry. He didn't beg. He simply nodded, the silent, chilling acceptance of a child forced to grow old before his time. Behind those dark eyes lay an understanding far beyond his years, and already the seeds of a plan were taking root, not for survival alone, but for a calculated, merciless campaign of retribution against every soul responsible for destroying his family. The scene he and Samuel staged inside the cabin was nothing short of a masterpiece in deception. Furniture lay overturned in patterns suggesting a violent struggle. Drops of Jacob's blood, drawn from a shallow cut, were flung in deliberate arcs to mimic the chaos of battle. A few of Samuel's personal items were removed to hint that the attackers had taken trophies. Most crucially, Thomas planted small, damning clues that would lead any investigator to believe his father and brother had been captured alive, likely for interrogation, perhaps for public execution. 3 days later, when hunters stumbled upon Thomas trudging along a mountain trail, rifle slung over one shoulder, his clothes torn and smeared with blood, he looked every inch the perfect victim. Traumatized, yes, but steady. Helpful without being suspicious. Vulnerable without being helpless. His explanation to Sheriff William Thornton was simple and convincing. The blood came from tending to his father's wounds before the company men dragged him away, the torn clothes from crashing through thick forest in a desperate night escape, pursued by men who swore they'd kill him if he interfered. Thornton saw nothing to contradict the boy's account. The quiet composure was easily explained as shock, and no one wanted to interrogate a grieving child too deeply. The sheriff, a veteran of Reconstruction's chaos, had long ago learned when not to ask questions. At 53, he understood that some truths were better left untouched, especially when the alternative might spark more bloodshed. But the discovery of the 3 bodies shattered that fragile simplicity. What had seemed a straightforward case of corporate intimidation now reeked of something darker, something dangerous enough to swallow anyone who looked too closely. The corpses lay in shallow graves near Elkhorn Creek, and with their discovery, Sheriff William Thornton knew he was standing on the edge of a disaster that could swallow the county whole. Not only his own career hung in the balance, but the fragile economic foundation of the region itself. The dead men had been executed with precision, shots placed with the cold efficiency of a trained marksman or someone born with an unnatural gift for killing. And yet, the only living witness was a boy who, by all rights, should have been running for his life instead of trading bullets with professional killers. The positioning of the bodies told a story the terrain did not want to give up. Someone had fired from an elevated vantage, though the surrounding ground offered precious few such perches. It was a puzzle best left unsolved. Thornton, caught between the mining company's demands and the weight of his own conscience, crafted an investigation that was as deliberate in its omissions as it was in its conclusions. The official record claimed Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchinson, and James Crawford had died in a violent altercation with Samuel and Jacob Weaver, who had then fled into the wilderness. Thomas Weaver, found blooded and alone, was painted as the sole surviving witness to a mining dispute gone tragically out of control. But those who knew better could not ignore the unsettling details. The group hadn't died in a chaotic firefight, they'd been cut down with surgical precision, likely by a single shooter. And then there was Thomas himself. No tears. No confusion. Just an unnerving composure, like he'd already rehearsed this part of the story. When questioned, the boy would meet the speaker's eyes with a steady, unreadable stare and answer with statements that were true, but told nothing. The company men came for Papa and Jacob, he would say. There was shooting. I ran into the woods and hid until morning. The Consolidated Coal Company, stung by the loss of 3 key enforcers and unwilling to invite further scrutiny into their methods, made a decision that would become their second, and perhaps most fatal, mistake. They buried the truth along with their men, choosing instead to draft new policies that would to prevent any repeat of such losses. To their minds, the quiet burial of 3 coal police was far safer than inviting a public inquiry that might expose the full extent of their coercive rule. What they could not see, and would never have believed, was that Thomas Weaver's actions had not been born of panic, but of cold, deliberate choice. He had already accepted that certain threats could only be erased in blood. The company's withdrawal was not, to him, a sign of restraint. It was weakness, and weakness, in his world, demanded exploitation. The snows came early to the mountains that year, and with them a season of deaths that began to tilt the balance of power in the coalfields. Overseers known for cruelty vanished down mine shafts without witnesses. Company storekeepers who had long bled families dry were found in their beds, victims of robberies in which the cash remained untouched but the life was taken with surgical precision. By February 1876, the first shape of a pattern began to form in Sheriff Thornton's mind. That month, an urgent letter arrived from Dr. Marcus Henley, the company's physician, and its contents chilled him to the bone. 3 more company men were dead in the past month, each case, on the surface, accidental, yet every one threaded with the same quiet brutality. Mine supervisor Garrett Mills had toppled into a shaft during a routine check, though witnesses swore he'd been far from the edge before lurching forward as if shoved by unseen hands. Vernon Polk, a store manager, was discovered lifeless in his locked office, a supposed heart attack, until the coroner noted a small, deliberate puncture just beneath the ribs. Imagine finding 3 dead men, each with a single word in their pocket, written in a child's handwriting, justice. That's exactly what Dr. Henley reported to Sheriff Thornton, and what came next was straight out of a nightmare. One victim had a thin, surgical wound behind the ear, precise, deliberate. Another, Augustus Blackwood, was found sitting at his kitchen table, coffee still steaming, eyes wide with frozen terror. No forced entry. No weapon. Just death, delivered like a ghost in the night. Thornton knew this wasn't random. It was a message. And he had to find the sender. That afternoon, he rode deep into the mountains, alone. Locals whispered about smoke in a hidden valley. When he reached it, his blood ran cold. A training camp. Built by a 13-year-old. Elaborate firing ranges. Rope and pulley moving targets. Life-sized wooden figures carved with surgical accuracy, every vital organ marked, every artery mapped. Some swung like prey in the wind, others were set up for sniper shots from impossible angles. And then he saw the journal. Page after page of surveillance, maps of company buildings, floor plans of homes, daily schedules of every target, and chilling notes on their fears, weaknesses, and routines. This wasn't a child's scrapbook. It was a war manual. From the trees, Thomas Weaver appeared. Spencer rifle in hand. Calm. Confident. Deadly. "I've been expecting you, Sheriff." What followed was a confession, not of guilt, but of strategy. Garrett Mills? Pushed to his death just like the miners he ignored. Vernon Polk? Slow, painful end, mirroring the starvation of children he overcharged and exploited. Blackwood? He died of raw terror, the same fear he'd used to control desperate workers. Every death was planned with military precision. And when Thornton asked how a boy could do all this, Thomas revealed the truth. His grandfather hadn't just taught him to hunt, he passed down 3 generations of survival tactics, making Thomas more dangerous than the coal company could ever imagine. And this was only the beginning. The old man had survived 2 wars, outlasted the bloodiest days of the frontier, and knew one thing: sometimes, the rules of civilization can't protect you from the monsters inside it. So he forged Thomas not just into a hunter, but into a weapon. Sheep forget how to be sheepdogs, and wolves take over, his grandfather had told him. Now, that lesson burned in Thomas's eyes. The coal company forgot something, he said, voice low and steady. Mountain people have been killing enemies long before corporations existed. Sheriff Thornton's stomach tightened. He had to ask, did this boy feel any remorse? Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared into the distance, as if weighing the meaning of life itself, and then delivered a sentence that would stalk Thornton's nightmares forever. "Sheriff, do you feel bad when you put down a rabid dog? These men were diseases, infecting everything they touched. They destroyed families, starved children, and turned honest work into slavery. I didn't murder them. I performed surgery on a sick community. The only tragedy is how long it took." The final confrontation didn't happen with gunfire, it happened with words. They sat beside Elkhorn Creek, where 3 bodies still lay beneath the earth. And there, Thornton found himself negotiating with a 13-year-old, who spoke like a general dictating the terms of surrender. Thomas's demands were clear. Compensation for the families of miners killed in preventable accidents. Immediate safety upgrades in every mine. An end to the coal police's reign of terror. And most chilling of all, written guarantees, legal documents binding the company to every promise. "You think this ends with me leaving," Thomas said, voice sharp enough to cut through the mountain air. "But I've already taught them something they'll never forget. Fear. They used to sleep soundly behind their guns and money. Now they know, these mountains breed predators they never imagined." The negotiation dragged on for 3 relentless hours, and by the end, Thornton wasn't sure if he had just made peace with a child, or signed a pact with something far more dangerous. The negotiation lasted 3 days. And when it was over, the coal company, once untouchable, arrogant, and armed to the teeth, caved to a 13-year-old boy they couldn't track, couldn't stop, and couldn't kill. Executives, terrified of losing more men to an invisible enemy, agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. But Thomas wasn't interested in promises, he wanted control. Proof of compliance. Regular reports. And most disturbing of all, a hidden network of miners' children spread through the hills, serving as his eyes and ears in every shaft, every store, every backroom meeting. The change was instant, like a switch had been thrown. Within weeks, mines that had been death traps for years suddenly had brand new safety equipment. Prices at the company store dropped overnight. The cruelest supervisors vanished to far-off districts. And the coal police? Gone. Their barracks at Devil's Rest abandoned so quickly that meals were still rotting on the tables. But Thornton soon realized Thomas's reach wasn't just intimidation. For months, the boy had been collecting every scrap of dirt on the coal company, safety violations, abuse, starvation wages, all logged with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. And before disappearing into the wider world, Thomas sent those reports to newspapers in Charleston, Baltimore, and Washington. The effect was nuclear. Investigations erupted that no amount of bribery could shut down. From Ohio, Thornton got letters. At first, they read like updates from a reformed man, education, new business ventures in Cincinnati. But under every line was something colder, the sense that Thomas was still sharpening himself for future battles. By 1885, he had become exactly what his grandfather forged him to be, a weapon disguised as a pillar of the community. His empire stretched into mining equipment companies, railroads feeding coal operations, and banks that financed the very industry he once bled. But now, he used his power like a sniper uses a rifle, striking with precision to protect workers' rights across 3 states. The miners of West Virginia never knew his name. But for decades, they felt his shield. Labor organizers got mysterious funding. Safety advocates found executives surprisingly willing to compromise. And the children of mining families. Thomas's shadow stretched far beyond his life. By the time he died in 1924, hundreds gathered at his Cincinnati funeral, knowing him only as a generous philanthropist. But while mourners spoke of charity and kindness, something strange was happening back in the coal towns. Supervisors who had been preparing to slash safety budgets suddenly reversed course. Company executives, once hostile to unions, became eerily cooperative. And a few of the most feared mine guards simply vanished. No explanations. No bodies. The truth was buried, literally. In 1915, floodwaters unearthed 3 shallow graves beside Elkhorn Creek. Investigators labeled them unknown casualties of labor violence. But they never found the 4th grave, hidden deep in the forest, the one holding Henry Caldwell, the man who betrayed Samuel Weaver's petition. Thomas had saved him for last. A cold February night, 1876. Days before leaving for Ohio, he paid Caldwell a visit. Only Sheriff Thornton knew. And he took that secret to his own grave in 1899. But in his journal, found years later, there was one chilling line. The boy understood something the rest of us never learned, that evil creates its own nemesis. And sometimes that nemesis wears the face of a child who learned too early that mercy is a luxury the innocent cannot afford. This story proves the most terrifying transformations aren't supernatural, they are born from the slow, grinding cruelty of the world. Thomas Weaver wasn't born a killer. He was made, shaped by men who never imagined their prey might learn to hunt them back.